Hey guys, and welcome back to Betwixt the Books. We are here with our second reading roundtable in the same month. Haha, oops, on May's being in June, but it's okay. It's fine. We're getting back on. We're doing our regular June one. It's Pride Month, so we thought we would bring a Pride theme to you. This time we chose to do LGBTQIA plus nonfiction, and we're all bringing something very different. We have one lovely guest with us this time. Normally we have two. If you haven't seen one of these segments before, it's where Gretchen and I bring on some of our lovely bookish friends to talk about the things reading recently. Some of them have themes, some of them is literally open to anything that anybody has been reading. If you want a more open one, that's happening next month, or you could look at the one that we did previously this month, last video, to see that. There is now a whole playlist because we've been doing these long enough that there's actually like a good amount of content if you just want to put us on in the background and listen to people talk books. Highly recommend that as well. We are going to go around and introduce ourselves first, tell you a bit about what we normally read and sort of like that sort of stuff. So maybe you can figure out which one of us you maybe align with more. And then we're going to go around and talk about the books that we're bringing to chat about today. So starting, as always, with Gretchen.
Hi guys, I'm Gretchen, and I actually put out a romance review last week. For those who don't know, that was one of the first books I had read in 3 months. And as someone who traditionally puts away 100 to 200 books a year, not having read a book in a couple of months was just like kind of a marker of like the level of depressed and busy we had reached. I am having some trouble, like, kind of getting back into the swing of wanting to record my own voice and then stare at my own face when I edit. But hopefully, I will continue to bring the reviews that I mainly like to post on the channel, which are usually contemporary romance novels, because I am a PhD student and I like to have this light, airy, beautiful world to kind of balance out. I saw a meme today that was like, reading for pleasure implies that there is reading for pain. And someone had commented they call it a PhD. So, two sides of the coin there. However, what you may or may not know, because I haven't posted one of these videos in a while, is when I do read nonfiction, as someone who focuses on in my PhD on the teaching and history of America and its involvement in the world, I read a lot of historical and political nonfiction. And so I am so excited to bring to you guys today. I haven't finished it because it's an absolute brick and I have been busy, but this is the first time in a really, really long time I have sunk into a history book and just been like enjoying it so much. You can look back at, I call it, at one point I was trying to read a biography on every single American president. So the playlist is called the American Presidential Reading Challenge, but we have gone so far from where we started. And you can also follow me on Storygraph for that as well.
I am Anne. I know I met Gretchen working at a library, and I met Michaela through Gretchen, and the book connection is kind of obvious. I usually read like Gretchen. I will read sort of typically contemporary romances, and Gretchen and I share some favorites. We started particularly in COVID when reading anything else was like, nope, not happening. And I spend I mean, that's sort of the basis. I will read poetry books, contemporary poetry. I will occasionally delve into some literary fiction and then discover or rediscover why I don't delve into it more. And I read odds and ends of nonfiction. I also of late have picked up pottery. So it's amazing how many pottery books are out there, as in nonfiction, but like millions of different So, and there's also Pinterest, which is really a dangerous rabbit hole if you people haven't discovered it. Anything you like, there are a gazillion images out there for you to put into a folder that you never look at again. So there you go. And I'll be sharing 3 books, 2 that I actually got through, and or 2 that I finished reading, and 1 that I am actually looking forward to and also not looking forward to, but it's an excellent, excellent book about LGT, yeah, poets actually. So there you go.
And then, hi, I'm Michaela. You will probably have seen my face from the channel. Normally, I am a speculative reader. I live primarily in horror, but I branch out to other things. You'll find me all over the place, though, in literary, sci-fi, fantasy, wherever you want me to go. I do primarily read queer books as of the last several years, so this is not outside of my wheelhouse. I'm here talking about queer books year-round. I just don't normally talk about the nonfiction ones. I do read them from time to time. It's just not stuff. Me and nonfiction generally, I pick it up and then it sits on my shelf for years and years and years. It's one of the reasons why one of my own personal reading challenges this year was to try and read 1 nonfiction book a month, is because I have so many on my physical TBR that I just don't pick up for no reason other than I don't normally go for a nonfiction book when I'm like picking things up for myself for taste. So happy to have a reason to read something on my TBR, as I always am. I'm gonna do an indigiqueer, their personal essays was what mine was, so I'm gonna talk about that. Gretchen, let's hear about this history book that is a behemoth.
And I just saying, like, you know, again, what we've been really intentional about with the buddy reading challenge that Michaela and I do every year. This is not technically on it, but it's kind of an offshoot, which is that, you know, we really, particularly this year, even though we've done this a number of years in a row, particularly this year, we really sat down and we said, okay, maybe we've read a lot of translated books, but they've all been by Asian authors, for example. And I know that's not technically true, but like, you know, we really sat down and we're like, okay, so just saying read a translated book, we want to push that a little further this year. And so, you know, we usually have like a queer romance on our buddy reading challenge. And this year we said that we wanted to do a queer historical romance because we hadn't done like a lot of that and seen how the representation is portrayed there. And so I like how this is a really interesting, again, Michaela wants to read more nonfiction and likes to read queer books, but doesn't normally overlap the two. So those are here. And I read a lot of nonfiction, but I'm not necessarily, because I'm so focused on like American history and politics, like obviously that's a part of it, but I don't necessarily focus on like this aspect. So I think that this is a really good, like, again, we've talked about all year, like really paying attention to your own reading and saying like, where can I push it to like learn more? Because for me, especially, I mean, I'm a PhD student, so this kind of tracks, but like knowledge acquisition is like one of my only personality traits. So this has been great. So I am so excited to talk about this book. So this was a book that was recommended to me by someone. I'd also seen it. It's called Secret City, The History of Gay Washington by James Kirchick. Now, I really want, I don't think that this title does this book justice. And I understand why the author has used this title, because he calls the secret city, that's a term that he uses throughout the book. I am only 54% of the way through it, somewhere in chapter 22, according to my audiobook, because the full audiobook is 26 hours.
Oh, God, Gretchen.
But so what I kind of did was, because this had been recommended to me, and I knew that we were doing this episode, I just kind of downloaded it and I was like, I'll just try it and I'll see, because again, like I have been having trouble reading. I certainly haven't been doing a very, like anything that's very dense in terms of my history books. I've been actually mostly doing podcasts, which are episodic and you know, I can do a little bit more of, I talked about a podcast in our last reading roundtable. So I really wasn't sure how this was going to go until the book started. And I realized that this is the history of gay Washington through a very particular lens. And it is how the history, I mean, it is kind of general, but like the entry point to this is how gayness has interfaced, and like this idea of keeping secrets and having to lead a secret life has led and interfaced a lot of the queer community in DC with the intelligence agencies of DC. And so it's telling this really interesting story about like how DC becomes a place that more and more traffics in its own secrets vis-a-vis the intelligence agencies. And as you know, America is growing into being a foreign, you know, power, a superpower. And therefore, and you know, at the rise of the security state and the rise of you know, more, you know, armed forces, national intelligence, you know, all that type, along with like the rise, the inclusion of the queer community, how that actually drew a lot of the queer community to DC, and also then how they're like, you know, trying to, it's, here's the catch-22, right? And so this book kind of starts out around the time of World War I. There's a very light beginning there with a story about someone and Woodrow Wilson. Sigmund Freud gets involved. It's very strange. But there is this, you know, when the communist threat becomes a really big thing, right? There is this alignment of being gay and being communist, even though communism at the time was like, yeah, those people need to die. So like it was this alignment of two things that they were trying to teach the culture to hate, even though in actuality, logically, those two things would very rarely coincide. But particularly communist Russia at the time is like, you know, was literally killing gay people. And so there's this really crazy thing that starts to happen where there is kind of this acknowledgement that people who are queer make excellent foreign service people and intelligence service people because they're so good at like, you know, already living kind of like on the corners and living a secret life and like knowing how, like having a better, almost awareness, right? And also really wanting those jobs because like, you know, it's really hard to work in the foreign service. You know, you're always traveling, you're away. People who want to start a family, want to have a home life, they don't necessarily want to do that. And so it was, the foreign service was a great place for people who didn't want to answer questions about why they weren't like married with kids. They were like, yeah, sorry, I'm out serving my country and all of these places. Then the idea that because they were gay, they were a national security risk. And there's this huge purge, essentially. About the time of the Red Scare, Kirchick uses the phrase lavender scare to go along with the Red Scare during like the McCarthy era and stuff, where they're like really purged from the government. But yeah, I mean, there are just so many stories, even in like the first part of the book. Although I have to say that if, in order to draw people to communism, there is this description at one point by an intelligence agency of these supposed orgy parties that the Communist Party was throwing to like attract gay people. And based on the description, if those had actually existed, I too would be a lesbian communist because those parties sounded dope. They were not actually happening, but they sounded great. I understand why people thought, yeah, I think the pitch should have really gone forward. What I have really enjoyed as someone who obviously, like I started reading about presidents, and then I kind of broadened from there. And so right now, like I said, it starts kind of in World War II. Where I am right now is the Lyndon B. Johnson era. And so it's moving. That's why this book is a brick. It's going through a lot of history. What I've found really fascinating is how many of these stories I know because I've read other books about this time, and how many of these stories I don't know, or how many players in these stories I do know, but this particular aspect of their identity was never told, or this particular story was never told. And as someone who's really interested in the project of how history gets told, I've been having a really fascinating time with that, and like some things that I do know and some new things that I'm learning. And then thinking again, this other layer about like, well, why wasn't this story in this book about Franklin Delano Roosevelt or something? So like I said, I'm not finished with it. What I would probably say is that I probably would not recommend the audiobook, even though that is how I'm listening to it, because the book covers so much time. I'm having a really hard time keeping track of all of the people. You know, and sometimes what will happen is like you learn this one story about this guy, and then he's like ejected from the Foreign Service because of, you know, he's charged with indecency and he's ejected. But then, you know, he comes back around in a different story where he's like, you know, and I'm like, I know your name, but like we've covered this history, like all this like dense history stuff. I mean, there's the story of the first person who tried to like sue for the right to have male pornographic magazines when things like Playboy were allowed, but he was getting shut down by the Postal Service. And then like this is like law, right? The birth of the certain type of like jurisprudence. The first person to sue the government on, I believe, wrongful termination. I can't exactly remember. So like all of this history is in here. And then like, so when characters are like coming all around, you're like, I know your name. Or they're like, as we discussed in a previous chapter, and I was like, oh, was that who that was? So it's hard, I think, to wrap, as someone who reads a lot of nonfiction, and you normally has like no problem learning information in this way. And I've gone through some pretty dense history books this way. I probably wouldn't recommend that, just so you would have the capacity to flip back and forth and maybe see this person, remind yourself of when they do come back around. But as long as you are into like a big history book, which I understand is not everyone's jam, I am having such a good time. I was telling Michaela before we got on, like it has been a while since I have just been like really engaged in a book this way. And like I've been like texting our group chat as it goes along, like, you would never believe this story. Because it's
drama.
Just like the drama and like what's happening, and like, yeah, I think it's just so, but that's again just to circle back as I end here to say why I don't think, you know, I've made comments about how sometimes like the titles of these books are like too like clickbaity. And in terms of this book, I'm like, you know, James Kirchick he talks about, there's an opening, he is a gay man, and he talks about how like he's always really wanted to write this book, and even he didn't exactly know like what his angle was going to be until, you know, he really got into it. And in this case, I'm like, this title should be more clickbaity, because rather than just like the history of gay Washington, it has this really extra fascinating extra layer that is not clear unless you really get into the description. Which may be slightly more, I don't say more enticing to people, but like knowing that it has that type of like flavor to it might grab some more readers and just like the secret history of gay Washington. I mean, I thought we were going to start like back in like George Washington. I was like, how far are we going back here? So yeah, I'm thankful for the recommendation, thankful that I started it. I can't wait to finish it. And yeah, read it, maybe to listen to it, but definitely pick it up. There is a lot of important history that is, I can confirm, having read like 15 books on some of these presidents, is just not in those books. So I really enjoyed it.
The marginalized communities get erased from history? No way.
Oh my God, it's almost like that's what I'm doing my entire PhD on.
I'm sure you'll be able to pull it in somewhere.
I will say, it was so interesting. I think the only story that I definitely knew front to back was the JFK one about his friend Lem Billings. And I think it literally is just because it's one of the, so far, the few positive ones. Because JFK was like, yeah, he tried to date me when we were in school. And I said, no, thank you. And he's still my best friend. And so I think that's probably why, right? Because you can tell something positive about a president's like perception, where all of these other stories are like, oops, you got found out at the Y and now you're fired and your entire career is destroyed.
It also sounds fascinating to me about just the things that we wouldn't, as hetero, being more in the heteronormal world, or having come from, I hate the word, but just sort of having come from that sort of universe, the things you never would think about, because it's just not sort of in your consciousness to think about. But the fact that a marginalized person who sort of lives a secret life would of course be an excellent spy or informant, or absolutely, of course they'd be the best people to take on that role for a whole host of reasons, but absolutely zero credit. Nobody ever, we all studied history, and I other than Stonewall sort of having been mentioned somewhere, aside from that, I can't say. I don't even think when I was in school that I learned that Alan Turing was a gay it's just like, nope, not relevant. That's not included.
I think that's just common in history in general. If someone is gay and they're of significance, we'll just not mention it, or we'll do and they were roommates. It's so weird that these two women lived together their whole lives, these spinsters. Right. Like, is that really what we're going? That's the story we're telling everyone? Okay.
Well, and then it's like, because I was just talking to Megan about this, and how like there are all of these rumors that, J. Edgar Hoover was specifically a gay man. And what I will say, and not that Kirchick is doing this at all, but I think if we to consider some other letters of the acronym, there is generally this like assumption, well, if this person was a bachelor or a spinster their entire life, then they must have been gay or lesbian, with the assumption they may just have been on like ACE, right?
Yeah.
And so I do, as I just want to put that, because like Megan and I were talking about this, and I was just like, he had so many enemies that had he ever done anything less, because there are stories, but they've been fairly decently debunked. And he was I'm not putting any labels on him whatsoever, but I will say that is like also like it's sometimes a generally historical thing where it's like, oh, this must have meant. I'm like, well, hold on. Maybe they just didn't want to kiss anyone.
Could have been that.
Right.
Yeah. And so I will, again, not that Kirchick is doing this or doing it intentionally, certainly. But that does tend to be like, he makes a good point. It's called the Boston marriage, where sometimes it was just two people who really just didn't want to get married. So they lived together their whole lives for any number of reasons. and how sometimes it is difficult to tell the lesbians apart from the women who are just in Boston marriages. But just to put that out there for a point of representation, that maybe sometimes there are just people who just didn't want to kiss anyone.
True.
Yeah, and I think that as a yet another marginalized sort of community, the sort of the notion, even in popular culture, the notion that someone who's ace or asexual, someone who just isn't, that's not their thing. You know, that's not what they think about when they dream of, you know, whatever, your frog, your prince, your, you know, whatever it is that you, whatever attracts you, that's just not what engages you with another human. But there, I mean, I remember the TV show House, like, it completely got debunked. That's just not a real thing. And I'm like, wait, how, it is a real thing for a lot of people. But, you know, and it just makes me think about the, you know, the entire sort of notion of different kinds of humans that exist, and the fact that people don't even know what those are. You know, like, we so need a basic education. And there probably is one, but it's certainly not being taught in schools, or, you know, I don't know.
Yeah,
God
I mean, it's
forbid
so
we
weird
teach
how
anything.
so often, particularly for like men or male of some sort of ish, I think it's just like they're so attached, like, oh well, clearly it's easier for people to believe that they have a sexual relationship than a deep friendship.
Yeah.
And that says wild things about masculinity that we do not have time to unpack. But that's just like, I feel like that's also like the, oh, well, clearly they can't have like just an intense, close friendship. It has to be like something else because otherwise they wouldn't act like this. And whereas women, the book talks about it, it mostly focuses on gay men, particularly because, you know, for a lot of this book, I'm in early history and women were allowed into a lot of these jobs for the first part, but also he was like, it was just so much easier for lesbians to go undetected because it was more acceptable for you to have close female friends than it would be for you to have close male friends. And I'm like, that's just sad.
Yeah, I mean,
that's just sad.
Yeah. That's still the case in a lot of ways, I think, in
particularly
our society.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And getting worse as like this like hyper masculine. Anyway, we don't have time to go into this. I'm really sorry, but I just wanted to like bring up a point of order that sometimes people can just be friends and people do not always want to kiss.
I think I was talking more about, we have a whole bunch of letters that are very clearly love letters between these two people, and we're still just gonna say that they were roommates.
And like, they were roommates.
They just had the closest, weirdest friendship. Which, yeah, there's like a difference between, there is a lot of discussion of putting modern labels on historical figures who wouldn't have considered that themselves in the first place. But then there is also just like willfully ignoring or outright choosing to redact certain elements of people's identities.
Yes.
The human ability to willfully ignore, you know, it's sort of fascinating and horrifying at the same time, depending on what, you know, which particular example you're looking at.
Yeah.
So
yes, I'm sorry. What you were saying made me like extend into this whole other thing that I was also thinking. Even, I mean, honestly, even as I was reading this book, I was like, there are other options.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
there
cool.
There are other options. It's true.
Yeah.
All right. And I know you said you had a couple of things. We only have 3 people today, so there's plenty of space and room for you to touch on whatever you want to touch on.
Absolutely. Like I said, I finished 2 books, and I also did them sort of as Gretchen, as audiobooks. And so with one of them, I think particularly, again, that sort of books that are sort of in some ways encyclopedic or could be useful at some future date, I think audiobooks don't do, just personally, I don't think. I'd like to actually have a copy. But the first one I'll talk about is a book that came out in 2015. So it's dated, it's a decade old, but this is sort of the
Oh no, don't talk about 2015 as a decade ago. Oh.
That's just facts, though. That's the
It
sad
is.
thing.
I'm sorry, continue. I'm just sad.
Yeah, but it's called This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. And it covers, it's basically said that, if there were an instruction manual, or if someone had thought to create one, I don't know that it's the first one, but it sort of says like, this is it. So in 2015, somebody, pulled all this information together from their own perspective and interviews from, all over. The author is British. And sort of mentioning sort of quickly back to the audio part of it, it's read by someone with not a British accent, which for me, it would have been more fun the geography would have fit better if the voice had actually been a British voice, but the information was still there. The voice is a good voice to listen to, but it's just, for me, it was sort of jarring to, and I'm in London and I'm talking with a Midwestern accent. This isn't quite working for me, but I'll keep trying to remember that's the way it is. But this is essentially a book I started sort of reading more and more LGBTQ books when my kids were starting in middle school, because I live in a community where there are a lot of people that have a lot of different, configurations of their gender and sexuality and interests. And, it's a more fluid place than many other places. And, or that there are places where it's not as fluid as it is in the city I live in. And because that was the community we lived in, I discovered that reading YA books is an absolutely phenomenal way. And I think one of the first ones I read was sort of a memoir about a young trans kid. And I just I had just learned a boatload of information that I didn't even have a vocabulary for. It hadn't been in my awareness. I hadn't gone searching for it, but that started, I have to say, ever since. And that's, my kids are now 24. So it's been a while since it's been before 2015, Gretchen. It's been over a decade.
No.
But anyway, this book would have been awesome. I wish I had found this book then, because it really does sort of lay out the sort of basic details of, gay life in different places at different eras. And I found it so useful in just learning. There are vocabularies they go through at this point in 2015, the sort of the norm of just sort of, as you can sort of realize, it was just LGBT was considered sort of all that you really had to say. But again, sort of, as I had said earlier, we should all know what all that is about. So, understanding them and understanding the differences that people can have would be really useful, but it's not common knowledge and it's not shared or taught or anything. But I found this book fascinating to read. I picked up so much stuff, and I think with this kind of encyclopedic book, you will I think you sort of keep it. I will probably end up, sticking it on my shelf, just because you remember different things at different points, depending on where you are and what's going on in your life and who's entered your universe or what awareness you've suddenly gotten. And again, this is my perspective. Everybody's a different reader. Everybody lives in a different universe. But I just thought it was so sort of straightforward and sort of funny. There are some things that are so unimaginable for marginalized people, and things that you're not considered an equal person to someone who, quote unquote, is normal. And I found that is really important for me anyway. It's important to keep remembering that. that, you know, I'm I'm white and I'm, you know, I don't have blue eyes, nor is my hair blonde, but close enough. You can't get, you know,
Yeah.
you don't get much more sort of, you know, whatever the norm is, if you can say it's there. But I think this book is incredible. I also think one of the questions in libraries that we often ask, like, who would I give this book to? I would give this book to just about anyone. I think even a young, you know, uh, a young kid, you know, a YA kid. Absolutely. Because if you're questioning or you're curious or you're wondering or your friend is or whatever, it's absolutely digestible for that audience. I wish I could give it to myself, you know, 10, 15 years ago, because all of us should have this information. You should realize, you know, the things that people don't tell you about. There's a whole section in the book about, you know, what they don't tell you about everything from gay sex to, and again, it's not crazy, but there's just so much practical, straightforward information. The voice of the guy is awesome. You know, the tone of the book is not in your face, but this is the reality, people.
Mm.
Get out of your whatever crazy prejudice, you know. And he doesn't, it's not a preachy book. It's just, here's the information. And this is kind of stupid comes up every so often.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I think I thought it was great. I enjoyed it, but I want the hard copy because I want to be able to go back. One of my favorite things was they went through, sort of in your love of history, Gretchen, they sort of went through the entire alphabet, but with each letter, you know, people who you should know with that last name that either have supported gay rights or have been, you know, it was just, but it was fun because I hadn't thought about it. You know, I hadn't thought about it just, but it was just kind of that's a neat capsule. You can walk away with that. And if I had the book, I could go back and go, okay, who is that I
Mm-hmm.
can't really, like you with too many people, like who, where? But anyway, that's my sort of roundabout way of saying, I think this is I really think this is sort of one of those elemental books that we should have. I think everyone should have. I think it should be given to everyone. I think people might reconsider with, you know, might understand a bit more, might go, huh, it really is just like, you know, a slight variation of whatever your normal is. So that was that one.
I think they
Highly
also
recommend.
put out a trans one after that too, I think. If I'm
They
remembering,
very likely.
if it's Juno Dawson, right? So I
No,
believe that also now several years old, I believe, but that one was like about LGBTQIA plus the umbrella, and then there is also one that's specifically about transness. So if you are a
trans. And
person that
yep,
wants to look more into that, and I'm sure it's
yep.
structured similarly, if not the same.
Similarly, and it's really well done. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to reading it. That was my sort of
Mm.
year goal of way back when, maybe it was last year, I can't remember, when we talked about our New
Yeah.
Year's wishes for the next year, whenever that was,
Feels like
whichever
a year
year,
ago, but it
in
was
2015, I don't really know.
yeah.
But if it was
We
that
have
far back,
lived many
even
lives since January.
I had hoped to read more books. Now I know why I meant to read more books,
Mhm.
because some of them really should be read. But yeah, you know, this was really, really cool. It is in some ways a little bit like an instruction manual, and I think that's useful. Yeah, I do, because, you know, I think that's useful, whatever it is you're interested in learning about. You know, it would be nice if there was an instruction manual about all the presidents or whatever. But anyway, that was my
It's just the
first,
inside of my head.
oh God, yeah, they don't come out with those. We know that. We've discussed.
I mean, they try to. I would argue with every single one of them, probably.
Yes, yes, exactly. I'm with you. but anyway, so that was my first, as I said, it's a little bit textbooky, but like in a good way. The second book that I read is, again, I listened to it, but there's a series of books called Pocket Change Collective, and they're sort of like audiobook wise, it was just about an hour, which is almost like nothing. But it just shared a perspective, and the book's title is The New Queer Conscience. And basically the book, again, sort of it sort of set up the stage of anti-queer sort of thinking, and how that, its presence in our current universe. So this book was written in, do I have the date? I'm going to say it was in the early 2020s. But yeah, 2021 came out, or it got an award, the Sidney Taylor Notable Book Award. But essentially, it sets the stage for that. But it essentially said that all of us, particularly people who are in the queer community, need to uphold all the other, like you need to stand for everybody in the community. And they obviously argued that all of us should be standing for everyone in the queer community. And it was I really liked this one. It sort of made me want to get up on a soapbox and do some good somewhere, and who to contribute to, and here's what you can do. And it was well done. The author's voice, Adam Eli's voice, is just, the perspective is really worthwhile listening to. And again, this is sort of like, if you were pulled in by my first book, this is a great one that takes it a little bit farther. It's a little bit more nuanced, the arguments about our need to support all marginalized communities, but this one in particular. Yeah, so that was my second. And this one, again, as I said, I did an audiobook, and this one was a good audio. It's sort of like a podcast, like Gretchen, you said. It's a short, it's one little episode, one little perspective. I think there were four points that the author was trying to get through. So yeah, that's my not very in-depth articulation of my second book. And it was only an hour, so there.
Easy.
Yeah, it is.
Something to listen to on your lunch break.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Someone gets an hour lunch break? Wow.
People in apparently corporate America get an hour lunch break.
An hour.
Sometimes it depends on the company. Some companies are stingy. But yeah, I've heard multiple companies.
You've heard this?
I have heard this.
Have any of us?
I mean, technically, we got them at the app, Anne.
Yeah, sure.
I just didn't take an hour, because then you had to stay an extra half hour. And I was like, I'm going to take a half hour. I'm going to leave a half hour, because I don't want to be here for an hour for my lunch.
I think those jobs with an hour lunch are also the jobs where they're like, you're technically here from 9 to 5, but you're actually working 24/7. And if we email you, you're emailing back. Like, right. It's one of those jobs.
I think they ultimately said they can't do that to us at the ATH, but I could be wrong about that.
Also, I mean, a library is slightly less than life or death.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, we're not talking about being physicians.
No, I don't need to be on call.
No, I don't want to be. There's no reason. Shall I go? Just mention the last book was fascinating. It's called Super Gay Poems, LGBTQIA plus Poetry After Stonewall. It came out this April, so it's a very new book, and the author is Stephanie Burt. And she's poet and a literary critic, and she essentially goes through poems about the queer experience and writers who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, trans, non-binary, gender fluid, and probably every other variation. I have not finished this, but I find it fascinating because each poem, so you get the author in the poem and then, you know, read the poem, but there's literary analysis afterwards, which certainly isn't everyone's thing to do. I also was joking with Gretchen and Michaela that, you know, after about paragraph 3, I'm like, oh God, this is like my old college, or what theoretically I was supposed to write in my college English papers. And it's like, oh, I don't wanna. But as I read through more of them, I was fascinated by what I learned about the author. So, you know, she describes the author and then sort of goes into the poem and where it fits into history and literary history. And it was just like, I'm thinking like, this is awesome. I found it fascinating, but it is ultimately, she's still doing literary criticism, which perhaps yeah, I think I left that when I left college with my English major. I'm like, yeah, I'm never going to read literary criticism. But it's fascinating. I think this book is just brilliant, but you've got to be able to get through the literary criticism to get all of the juicy information. However, let me add the caveat that if you don't particularly like poetry, or your brain's not capable, which mine was not when I was reading this book, it wasn't doing poetry. It was like, yeah, oh, nice words in a nice sort of shortened format. I have no idea what they meant. Guess what? You've got to, here's what this poem was about from my perspective, from the author's particular perspective.
Right.
Which might have been a little bit too dense for me, but on the other hand, I'm going like, oh, okay, I gotta sum up. So I so recommend this book. I again, this is another one that I'm grabbing. Actually, the book, because poetry for me is hard to. It's hard on an ebook. I need the book.
Yeah.
And
Poetry is
I'm also
definitely a
fascinated. Yeah. It's just it's really well done. I think this is really cool. Weird because like I said, I apparently once swore upon my life that I would never do literary criticism. But needless to say, I love this book. And again, I sort of historically, I think of my 3 books. They really are chronologically going in order, but I find this one in some ways the most fascinating. And, you know, from 1969 to the present, there's a lot of poetry that I don't have a really full awareness of. I studied 19th century poets, and that's about where I criticized and said bye.
Yeah.
So I found it fascinating. You will learn a huge amount from this book.
Love it. It sounds like it's also a
So
good book for someone who doesn't normally read poetry because it gives you that, like, here's what you may not, if
Yeah.
you're not a poetry person, here's maybe some
yeah,
insights into how to read poetry, or at least how this one person reads these poems.
yeah, is looking into exactly. And I find that sort of a fun combo
Yeah.
because you will also learn about LGBTQ history and writers of significance. It's like it's really cool. From my perspective. And like I said, my brain was just it couldn't quite engage with poetry, but then like the analysis, I'm going like, oh, okay, I got that. But then all the other information was coming in. So of all 3 books, I found them useful for different reasons.
Hmm.
I found this one just sort of interestingly compelling because I don't know. I've never thought to get my history from literary criticism. It's really cool. I'm odd that she probably got a PhD in this, but it's well done.
Yeah. Awesome. I actually might pick that one up But I feel like I need a physical poetry book in front of me
Yeah,
person because
yeah.
poetry needs to be annotated. I feel like it doesn't. An audiobook of
Yeah.
poetry, as much as like listening to slam poetry like makes sense to me, something on this level, I feel like I would.
No, and this one I actually did this by ebook, and it doesn't. I find it does not work as well. I have a copy from the library as well. It doesn't work as well in the ebook. It's basically the same information, but I really with poetry, I want to be able to write on the
Yeah.
like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
I feel like also ebook, even because I know, and I mean I know other people will read on an e-reader, but like I know when I traditionally just read on my phone.
Yeah.
And you know, it can mess with formatting as well. And poetry that is meant to be read, in that case, is formatted in a certain way. The lines stop and end. If there's italicized, if there's like a hyphen, or like, I mean, there's so much to poetry that like needs to be experienced the way, it truly is a visual medium in the same way a painting is in a certain way. It has to be understood in the same. Yeah.
But it's a good one. I think this one, I would, there's just something that was sort of mind-blowing about it all in so many directions.
Nice.
Yeah. So,
well, I'm glad.
I highly recommend this. I think it's awesome if you're interested in the LGBTQ, you know, the whole, it's just, it's a fascinating way to look at it.
Nice. My turn?
Yeah.
Your turn.
Okay. Initially, when I was gonna come here, I had borrowed the audiobook of Ace, funnily enough, from our conversation earlier. But I started listening to it and I felt like I wanted to have a physical copy of that one to like highlight and sticky note, so I put it down for now. And then when I was switching over, I was listening to one of the podcasts I listened to called No Books on a Dead Planet, which is all about like climate fiction and nonfiction for people who might be interested in that. And the most recent episode of that was about Love After the End, which is a collection of two-spirit indigenous science fiction short fiction. And the editor of that has a book that I read that was personal essays. So I went for that instead. It was shorter, and I find that like memoir and personal essay is a little bit easier to just sort of sit and listen to versus something that's like a bit more textbooky that you want to like have tangentially, unless you're Gretchen. Gretchen and I are opposite on audiobooks though. Like Gretchen does not like fiction on audio, and I love fiction on audio, so you know,
if you physically cannot do fiction on audio.
Yeah, so I mean, to each your own.
Yeah.
To each your own. Totally fair. But yes, so I read Making Love with the Land by Joshua Whitehead, who is a OG Cree First Nations Canadian two-spirit author. It is a collection of essays, so it's not like one continuous story. Each of them does focus a bit on being indigenous or indigeneity, I guess would be the word there. But there are essays on being two-spirit. There are essays on being gay. I will say trigger warnings. There's some grief sections, some sections on eating disorders, and there was a sexual assault mentioned in one of them. So if any of those things bother you or that you don't want to read, maybe stick away from this one. But I really enjoyed it. I will say that the author is a poet, and you can tell that the author is a poet. So I know not everybody likes that sort of prose writing when it like verges on lyrical at times and like structure is weird. So if you're a person that kind of struggles with that, this might also not be for you. Especially it was rough because the first essay was probably the most poetic out of all of them. So it really like threw you in with like fragments and images and like all of the stuff. And I was like, oh no, is this whole thing going to be this? But it wasn't. Some of the as it went on, they became more structured and coherent depending on which essay you're reading, it's more or less of that. I really enjoyed it. I feel like obviously I read queer books all the time, and for people who don't know, my dads are gay. So I had conversations with my partner Isaac about how I'm sort of culturally queer, which is an interesting thing to talk about because I was raised like most of my parents' friends were queer. My dads are gay. So it's like interesting in the way that like my perspective on the world is probably different than a lot of other people's, just for that fact. Um, so I'm always like delighted when I get a new perspective, and definitely like the indigenous queer community is very different from like the white queer community. And I'm sure the same could be said for any other POV as well. Like if you're reading from Black queer culture or Latinx queer culture, I'm sure all of those also have like very specific things that are much different to the white queer experience, but there are obviously overlaps for all of them. There was like a very powerful the one finish a sentence, Michaela. The one essay that did have the sexual assault part in there had a lot of discussions about how he moved away from sort of queer, the overarching queer culture, like the white conformist queer culture, because of that experience, and relating the way that that experience was for him to the way that white people came and quote unquote raped the land that we all live on. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff that's going on, like relating queerness and indigenousness and sort of the hurts that we have here. That's there. So I do know that in November we are having our reading roundtable theme is going to be on Indigenous lit. So if you want to join us in reading themed for that month, even though you aren't, I highly recommend picking up this one for that and maybe talking to me about it in the comments of that one or in the comments of this one, because it was very interesting to me. I didn't even realize it because, like I said, this was introduced to me from that podcast on the short fiction, which was on my TBR, but actually Joshua Whitehead wrote a fiction book called Johnny Appleseed, which has been on my TBR for quite a long time as well. So if you want anything, he has a poetry book, a fiction book. He's the editor of a collection of like sci-fi, fantasy, climate fiction, and then now this memoir type thing. There's something across the board, all of there, and I think he's only like 35, so he's got like a huge body of work.
Prolific.
I know, right?
Oh.
So yeah.
Calm down. Some of us 30-somethings are tired.
Yeah, I mean, just pedal to the metal. I mean, all for it. I'm here for it. I think, yeah, I recommend it. I do feel like there's a lot of because of the structure and the language there is also a lot of indigenous words, and like the discussion of like the language gaps and like inabilities that English has, that like native language has a lot of structural things that just English can't take over. I wish that I had a physical copy to read alongside what I was listening to. Just for clarity, because I feel like I missed some stuff and I would like to like have that, but I don't think that it was like a bad audiobook, and it was read by the author too, so yeah. Yeah, that's definitely one that I would recommend if people like memoir or personal essay. I think it was like a relatively short audiobook. I think it was like 6-ish hours, so it's not hard at all. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a good one, and an interesting one. So if you're more of that type of person and less of a history person, I have this to recommend to you. I mean, I also, like, this year I've read a bunch of queer nonfiction because I've been trying to do this nonfiction thing. So I read People Change by Vivek Shraya, which is another trans author, which is a super short little book. If people are interested in that, and that one is all about the different ways that we reinvent ourselves throughout our lives. and like sort of accepting that and relating it to transness as well. And then if you're like me and are a huge horror person, last year at the end of the year, I read It Came from the Closet, which is a collection of essays, each of them from a different queer person talking about their favorite horror movie and the ways that they relate their own personal queerness to that horror movie, which was super interesting and I loved. So if you like from multiple backgrounds, multiple like different types of queerness, transness, gay, lesbian, all that sort of stuff, as well as Black people, Latinx people, Asian people, like all of these people coming together to talk about their love of horror as well as their queerness and the ways that those two things intersect. Which the most interesting of which is, for the most part, all of these queer people relate more with the monsters than they do with the victims, despite quite often queer people being of a lot of hate crime. So that's super interesting as well. If you like that sort of thing, I highly recommend that one as well. So there's a lot of really great queer nonfiction out there for people to pick up something. Highly recommend all of that stuff. So, yeah.
I love memoir is such a great way to learn. I don't know, there's something for me anyway that memoir is such a great way to get a window into someone who's different
Yeah.
from whatever,
Mhm.
which is everyone.
Yes. Yeah.
But it is an amazing way to get to see a different perspective of the world. And because memoirs tend to come across, it's a human writing about themselves. They're going to come across as human, regardless of what other, what other labels you have or other, other ways you have of existing. Again, I've found, I can't wait. I'm so excited you mentioned these, Michaela, because I'm really looking forward to adding them onto my list.
Nice.
I also do just want to shout out the one that I almost read that is still like on my my reading list, but it did come out far more recently. And when I was looking for a book that I needed to get a hold of very quickly for this episode, it came out last month, so it was a little bit harder to get a hold of. But it's called So Many Stars: An Oral History of Trans, Non-Binary, Genderqueer, and Two-Spirit People of Color by Caro D. Robertis. This is an oral history of I'm reading off the book here, of a generation of queer and trans elders of color, from leading activists to artists to ordinary citizens, to tell their stories of breathtaking courage, cultural innovations, and acts of resistance, all in their own words. It's based on hundreds of interviews, and so if you want to go with something like that, this is obviously meant, I believe you can get it in hardcover, but I believe this is something where one of the reasons it was like really high on my list is because this audiobook, like it's an oral history, right? And so he has recorded all of these people speaking. And so I believe it would be an incredibly powerful audiobook to read, which is why I'm sure the waitlist for the audiobook is a bajillion years long. Or it was when I looked, and I knew that I could not get it in time for this episode. So in case also you're looking for something that does then feature people of color at the center, because I can tell you for a fact that even though I find that, I don't know, I'm still an LBJ, but like, it's all white people. And so there's already that kind of dominance. Obviously there's been some other voices brought out here in this discussion, but for people who might be looking for a very specific, and what sounds like an incredibly powerful audiobook, I'm just still on the wait list. So who knows when that will come through.
My reading list just got longer. Actual books, as opposed to the, oh, what do I want to read now? Flip, 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 flip. Nope, 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 nope.
That's totally valid as well.
I know, but
it's totally valid.
It's actually nice to have things that I actually want to get my hands on. Like, I'll go back to my New Year's, actually read physical books, because there's so many amongst all the ones that we've talked about that just, I think, would work best as actual physical copies of something.
Yeah. So this has been an incredible discussion. There has been a lot of great things that we brought, and then other things that like were mentioned or titles that were tossed around, future books that we can't wait to read in this category. And of course, if you have a recommendation for us or anyone else who watches this video, please do leave that down in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest thing is to find the good books, right? And that's part of why we do things like this, where we try to bring all of our friends along on our journey to read different and widely, at least for us, so that you can learn new things. Because like I said, like books are such an incredible repository, and I love learning new things. It, rather than making me feel like, gosh, I should have known that, I'm like, wow, I'm so glad I know this now. Which I wish was more of a constant thing about people in this world being uncomfortable that they don't know things. You can always learn. But anyway, we hope that you have enjoyed this. Thank you so much to Anne for joining us for this episode. And bringing so many books. We promise we did not make her do that. She did that all on her own. So thank you so much for joining us. Michaela and I have actually been plotting some more consistent Betwixt the Books content now that my dissertation data collection is done. We are hoping in July to fulfill one of our buddy reading challenges, which is actually something I already talked about, which is to read a queer historical romance. And then we have a couple of other ones down the pike, including some translated books, and also potentially finishing a series we hated. Because one of the characters, like the only character I think, honestly, that we did not at least partially dislike, got their own book, and therefore we feel duty bound to read it. So we've got some, I think that literally covers like a whole gambit of like translated, like romance, like potentially rage inducing. So we are very hopeful that this will happen. Try to get back in the swing of things with our own reviews as well. We'll see, but all I have to say is whether we are reviewing it or not, whether you are reviewing it or not, reading is important, especially now. If you are a podcast person, if you are an audiobook person, if you are whatever it is, to stay informed and learn a new thing, and just stay engaged with everything that is happening right now. The entire point is to make you disengage and be very tired. And so however you choose to do that, just stay engaged. So we will try to do our best as well, and we'll see you next time.